One of the most iconic houses of worship in human history recently burned, leaving the world stunned and shocked at the loss of such a precious artifact. Most American churches look nothing like the Notre Dame Cathedral, but what if there's something specific about this building that we could learn from? Today, we'll talk about being intentional with your church building and creating something to last. Well, hey there, and welcome to Pro Church Tools, the show that helps you share the message of Jesus while navigating the biggest communication shift in 500 years. I'm Brady, Shearer, joined as always by our host, Alex Mills.
Brady, I think there's something so significant about creating something that lasts. Like maybe you've been to an art museum where there's a collection, an installment of like really old art. You just like stand in front of it and you're kind of just like taken aback by, how is this thing this old? For me, it's books. Like you've been to my house, you've seen my library. A lot of my books are old. And sometimes and I'm getting transparent here. Not a lot of people know this about me. Sometimes I will sit in my study and take an old book. And a lot of my old books are so old that I don't actually read from them. I'll just like hold it. And sometimes I'll smell it because there's something so significant to me as a creative myself about creating something that lasts, right? I look at those books and I say, okay, they have stood the test of time. Like some of my books are 200 years old. I have, over 100 Bibles where that text, those books themselves aren't this old, but the text within those books is thousands of years old. The creation that's inside of these things is so significant that it stood the test of time, right?
Well, and it's so significant to you that you want to keep it because it means something. We were cleaning out my old house this past week, and you were coming in, you were like, oh yeah, maybe I'll take, this fan, and I'll take it. Well, what did you take?
I took, I don't know, like some little things, but...
Oh yeah, some little design, but yeah. There are these old books that were given to me the year before I went to Bible college. I went to a pastor's house. He was in his 80s, and I went downstairs with my buddy Christian, and he gave us all of his books from him being a pastor for like 60 years. And he's like, if these can mean something to a Christian leader who's going into training, it'd be great to pass them on. And I still have a ton of them. And you saw them and you were like, I will have these now. And I said, you will have these now.
Yeah, sir. They mean a lot to me, and you hit on it exactly. And that's the reason I don't open a lot of these books, is because I want them to last. I want them to continue. And I grew up here in the Niagara region. People come from all over the world to visit Niagara-on-the-Lake to see its history, to see the buildings, because this is where the War of 1812 was fought and won. So there's all kinds of old buildings in Niagara-on-the-Lake. There's old military forts, but they're only a couple hundred years old. The town was burnt down in 1812, and so nothing is a lot older than that. So that's about 200 years. There's a building in France, of course, most of us know it, the Cathedral of Notre Dame, or Notre Dame for our Francophone roots here in Canada. But we will continue.
We're really butchering the name. We talked about this before. What are we going to say? We are Canadians, French Canadians, but we went with Notre Dame, but we don't like it. Anyway.
So we're going to continue saying Notre Dame from this point out. There was a tragic, and this happened as of this recording, this happened yesterday, a tragic fire at this cathedral where when I saw it burning on Twitter, I thought, like, nothing will last here. Like, this will be over. And I mean, miraculously, a lot has been recovered and a lot of the artifacts were saved. But this cathedral is so old, and it's one of the most impressive religious artifacts of our time. Construction for this cathedral started in the year 1160 and was initially completed around 1260. So it's been around for, almost 900 years. And so many people, Christians and non-Christians alike, travel to this cathedral every year. It's estimated 30,000 tourists a day see the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And when it was burning and we're watching it live on Twitter, there was like this collective sense of mourning, of loss. Like I said, from the Christian camp and non-religious alike, we could all appreciate that this was a work of art. This was something special. This church, this Catholic house of worship, there was something significant about it, and now it's gone. And I heard somebody say this once about churches, because if you look at a lot of American or Western churches, Protestant churches, they're not really constructed in the same way that Catholic cathedrals are. There's not a whole lot of, ornate architecture, what have you. And somebody proposed this hypothesis. It's that Catholics don't actively look forward to a literal rapture like some North American Protestants do. And so their buildings don't reflect a group of people who think that Jesus is coming back anytime soon. The hypothesis is this, that when they built a house of worship, they were trying to create something that would last. They were trying to create something with intention. And I think no matter who you are listening to this podcast today or watching this video, if you work in church or involved in church, there's something to glean from this, being intentional about what we do with our houses of worship. And you may be thinking at this point, like, but the church isn't a building. The presence of God isn't in an ark in a tabernacle anymore, right? Like you and I are the temple of God. We host the presence of God, and we're the stones that build the global church. And yeah, of course, that's true. But most of us happen to meet in church buildings on Sundays, and so we do have these buildings. And I think there's something significant about being intentional with our houses of worship. I read this book once called The Art of Curating Worship by Mark Pearson. And it's geared towards worship leaders. And he makes his argument. He says this. He says, I don't like the phrase worship leader. I like the phrase worship curator, because in the same way that a curator of an art installation would pay attention to everything that's going on in that space to have somebody have an encounter with that piece of art, I think we do the same thing as worship leaders. And so we've taken that super literally at our church. Our church does not look like a Catholic cathedral, but everything about our church space and our house of worship is super intentional, whether it's the temperature or the paint colors that we choose or the art that we choose to put on the wall or what we say or what we sing. Everything is intentional as to point whoever's meeting at our church towards an encounter with God and try and remove hindrances that would stop them from having an encounter with God. And that's what I think we're seeing as this cathedral has burned and will now be rebuilt, is that even for non-Christians, the intention of the architecture and the art that was housed inside of this cathedral have facilitated an encounter with the divine. And I think that's something that we can all kind of recapture in our practices at church, whether you're a preacher or a worship leader or a graphic designer or a volunteer organizer. And everything that we do, I think there's an opportunity to learn something here and employ a little more intention in what we're doing, even when the building is concerned, to create something that lasts.
So, Alex, you were the architect, forgive the pun, behind this episode of Pro Churchills. You're like, hey, we should really do an episode on this. And I at first was a little bit resistant because I'm the one that's learning in this episode. I don't have too much of substance to say, of value. I remember my wife and I, when Brittany was pregnant with our first and only child, we went to Chicago for the first time. Chicago's home to the Natural Museum of Natural History. Natural History. It's like the best one. And the way that I literally cannot say it is a reflection to my general indifference towards museums, towards historical monuments. When we go to places, it's never on my list of to-do to see monuments or to see museums of natural history or whatever the museum may be. You and I are headed off to Barcelona in just a couple of weeks. Yeah. We've got our tickets to La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, along with Park Güell. We're going to the Alhambra Palace in Granada. These are the places that are some of the most regal cathedrals. You just thinking about it are internally salivating at the idea. We're going on this walking tour through the Gothic Quarter. Yeah. I know you're just going to leave. Me and our wives are going to disappear and get lost into Barcelona. You're going to come back with 800 books. You're going to be like, yes. I live here now. I rented that apartment. Sorry. See you later. I'm no longer a pastor. Yeah. It's just me, paella, and Spanish architecture now.
Yeah.
That is lost on me as a 28-year-old. I think it's something that I'm going to appreciate more as I get older. I remember my grandma, when we were younger, she would take me to art museums, in Ontario. She said, look, these are some of the best art that Canada has ever produced. And I was like, this is the worst thing that I've ever done. Spending hours in this museum, it's lost on me. And so it's difficult sometimes for me to quantify the importance or the merit of something like this, which sounds, even as I'm saying it, quite monstrous. What a terrible thing to say. But I remember when I was a kid, and I grew up Pentecostal, and so we would have these songs we'd sing, we are standing on holy ground. And I know that there are angels all around.
Nice.
Jonas behind the camera is
I don't know that one.
Jonas is like, oh, Jonas was up there on
Jonas
the pads.
is on the floor, actually.
Jonas was leading on the pads. My wife's singing the song. Jonas's dad is there with the acoustic, and I'm at the altar going, yes, Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And then I remember coming to a point with my theology where I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense to me, especially because we weren't standing in some regal cathedral that had been around for 200 years. Like, this carpet's way too purple for this to be holy ground. And so I have difficulty reconciling those two things, because my theology would state, like, whether you're meeting in a cathedral that was built in 1160, finished in 1260, that is one of the most iconic monuments of Christendom in human history, or you're in a developing nation meeting in a basement underground and no one knows you're there, and it's not at all regal in any way. Neither of those things matter. And yet there's some merit to a beautiful piece of art, whether that be an old hymn that has so much weight to it because we've been singing it for centuries, or a building that epitomizes so much of our Christian faith for good and bad in its architecture. So I don't know what I should be doing here.
Well, I think there's some solace for you, because I don't think that this appreciation is completely lost on you, because maybe, although you can't appreciate architecture and books like I can, and I'm surely people are listening are in the same camp. They'll be like, Alex, I don't know what you're doing smelling your books, but like, you need to figure your life out. But you, Brady, I know you well enough to know that you appreciate and you see God in music and in design, whether it's print design or digital design. There's all different kinds of elements of creation that you identify with as being taken aback by and seeing God in, that I don't. And I think that's the point here, is that, especially in the Western church, we think about teaching people about God as music and a message on a Sunday morning. But I think everything that we do, we've been created by a creator to create. I say that all the time. And I think that's true of everyone. And we think of teaching people about God in those two ways exclusively. But I think that there are so many other things that are teachers about who God is and what he's like. Scott, the painter, is one of my favorite artists. And actually his art is what kind of adorns the walls in our church, because he does some really incredible stuff. He said this about Notre Dame yesterday. He says, religious folks in America don't really understand this because we build religious buildings for a teacher. We don't build buildings to be a teacher. Cathedrals of Europe are the teachers. To a mostly illiterate culture, they help teach the concepts, wisdom, and stories of the scriptures through imagery, sculpture, and architecture. So I think this is the thing. And we say this at the beginning of every episode. We're helping you to share the message of Jesus. And that's just what we're trying to do, right? We're all just trying to retell what we think is the greatest story of all time. Now, we do it through music and a message on Sunday mornings, but what if we could kind of open up our options here and consider that we could tell the story in so many different ways. We can tell it through art and architecture and through stained glass and for music. And there are so many ways and so many teachers of who God is. I think we do ourselves and the church a disservice if we just reduce it to a message and some music. But if we could consider that everything has an opportunity to teach somebody something about God, maybe we could be responsible for creating something that thousands flock to every single day to see and appreciate, who don't even believe in the God that we do.
Great thoughts from Alex, as always. That'll do it for this episode of Pro Church Tools. We'll see you next time.
Rock, paper, scissors.
I win. Like the video.
Rock, paper, scissors. Rock, paper, scissors.
Oh, I win. Subscribe to the channel.